Hello, good afternoon, everybody. This is Frank McNally from Public Spend Forum. I appreciate all of you joining us today for this webinar. We're going to have a lot of fun. I'm joined by Dan Ward. Dan, are you there?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody.
Excellent. Dan's in McLean. I'm in downtown DC, so we're connecting by phone. And if anybody has any audio issues, or if you can't hear us well, or if you can't see the slides or anything, just type a note in the chat or in the Q&A, and our producer will see it, and he can bird dog that for us. So we've got a little bit to cover today, don't we, Dan?
We sure do. It should be a fun little discussion in the chat here.
Absolutely. So why don't we just take a quick minute and introduce ourselves. And I will attempt to do that by clicking on the slides. Let's see. Why is that not working? Hey, Jonathan, if you're there, can you? For some reason, I can't advance the slide. Oh, there we go. Okay. Just a small technical glitch. All right, so Dan is really the star for today. I'm just going to kind of be the color commentator, try to move things along. But Dan, you're our SME, you're an author, and you've been doing innovative things in the government for over 20 years. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today for this discussion about innovation, and specifically simple innovation and this FIRE method. Like Frank mentioned, I was in the Air Force for a little over 20 years as an active duty engineering officer, program manager, and technology developer. So I spent my time helping to shepherd the development of new technology projects for the military and for the intelligence community. Along the way, I kind of picked up sort of a specialty in rapid innovation methods and published a couple of books on the topic with HarperCollins. The first book I wrote was called FIRE: How Fast, Inexpensive, Restrained, and Elegant Methods Ignite Innovation. And so the book is all about rapid innovation principles and practices. It's full of stories and examples of kind of what has been done and what could be done in the future. And that's what we'll be talking about today.
And it's a great book. Some of you might recall it or might be familiar with it. It was picked up as one of the case studies in the White House's Innovative Contracting Case Studies document that was published about mid-2014. FIRE was one of those case studies. Dan also released a pretty fun publication 6 to 8 months ago on how to innovate inside the federal acquisition regulation. And if I could remember that title off the top of my head, I would give it. Maybe you remember it, Dan.
You know, I deliberately gave it somewhat of a long and funky title, just to sort of mask the interesting content that was in it. The working title, or the long title, was something along the lines of a brief guide to agilities, flexibilities, and simplifications within the federal acquisition regulation. If I called it a dummy's guide to the FAR, I think I probably would have gotten in trouble for copyright. So I went with that title. And basically, it's my short guide to the FAR, finding and highlighting and explaining some of the simplicities, the agilities, and the flexibilities that are actually in that regulation that are calling us to do a lot of the things that acquisition reformers have been saying we should be doing. Turns out the FAR says we should do it too.
Yeah, it's a great book. The FAR is not so bad itself. We talked about it in one of our first podcast episodes, and that's kind of how we got to know each other. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Frank McNally, again with the Public Spend Forum, and I'm our Director of Learning and Content Development. And I'm happy to have Dan today because I think this is really going to be fun and interesting. So without further ado, why don't we get started? And we're going to get started with a tale of two projects. Two projects that are pretty actually similar, but a lot different, as a matter of fact. Dan, what's the first project there on the right that we want to talk about? Tell us a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, so the first picture there is a supercomputer, and it's actually the opening story in my book FIRE. It's a supercomputer called the Condor Cluster. It was developed in 2010 by the Air Force Research Lab in tiny little Rome, New York. Great little location, way out in the middle of nowhere. And so this team built this supercomputer, and it was actually the fastest supercomputer in the entire Department of Defense. So the Pentagon has access to some pretty high-speed machines. This beat all of them. And they built it for 1/10 the cost of a comparable supercomputer. It uses about 1/10 of the electricity. But the really cool thing about it, the reason I love this particular story, is they built it out of 1,760 PlayStation 3s. And not even the latest and greatest version of the PlayStation 3. This is an older model that they were able to basically buy a bunch of them at a discount. So it was made out of gaming consoles, but it was not itself a game. And I can't emphasize this enough. It outperformed every other supercomputer that the Pentagon had access to. The reason that matters is that when we take a look at best-in-class, world-class, first-in-class new technology systems, turns out we don't have to spend decades and billions to develop these. And the sort of sub-lesson for this particular story is that if that team had had a larger budget, maybe a budget 10 times as big as the budget they actually had, what would they have done? They would have bought your standard supercomputer, and it would have performed at a certain speed, but it would have cost them 10 times more than what this one cost. So we have lots of options.
Where do you buy a standard supercomputer, Dan? Is that on Amazon?
I think Best Buy carries them probably. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly supercomputer developers and vendors out there. I've never owned one, but actually the desktop I'm looking at right now would have probably counted as a supercomputer even 10 years ago.
And the story on the right, so I think that's Legos. Tell me about what's going on there.
Yeah, so I think the one on the right, the Legos, is actually sort of a conference room in the Death Star. I've published a lot of articles and a couple books over the years, but the piece of writing that I produced, the piece of my writing that's got the most attention, was an article about military technology lessons from Star Wars. Turns out if you're going to write something and you want it to go viral, boy, mentioning Star Wars or any kind of pop culture references seems to go a long way to helping make that happen. And the basic message in that story was build droids, not Death Stars. That these big, expensive, complicated systems that tend to be over-engineered tend to deliver very little to the fight. And in the article I explained that Death Stars keep getting blown up, and that the droids, the simple, the low cost, the elegant little pieces of technology tend to outperform their specs. They tend to do more than they were designed to do, whereas the Death Star ends up just a smoking cloud of space rubble and actually does much less than it was intended to do.
I mean, there's some important lessons, obviously, in this, and it's the characteristics of winning projects versus losing projects. You call it cheap winners and expensive losers in your book. And we've got somebody out there that lost audio, Jonathan. I don't know if you can help. But if anybody else still is not getting the audio, let us know. But real quickly, so then the losing characteristics, the Death Star, you said are large budgets, large teams, and long schedules, whereas the winning characteristics are skeleton crews, shoestring budgets, and cannonball schedules. I'm confused. I mean, isn't it always better to have more money, more help, and more time?
Yeah, you would think that, but when you actually look at the data, and I like talking about the Condor cluster and the Death Star, and those are good individual data points, but they're more anecdotes. When you actually step back and look at larger portfolios, we take a statistically relevant look at what types of projects succeed and which types of projects fail, we find that you really can bin them into two main categories. These sort of winning teams and losing teams, the cheap winners and the expensive losers. And I think we borrowed that phrase from the Standish group, some of their research. But the winning characteristics, sort of the formula of an effective tech development project, tends to be a small team with a short schedule and a tight budget. So I characterize it as a skeleton crew, a shoestring budget, and a cannonball schedule. But when we have a lot of time and a lot of money and long schedules and big teams, that formula, that combination, tends to result in systems that cost more, take longer, and do less than anyone envisioned. But interestingly, it's not just the size of the budget, it's not just the length of the schedule that matters, it's also our attitude towards these attributes. So do we view our tight schedule and our tight budget as something to be proud of, something to stay within, or do we view that we don't have enough money, so we're going to complain about it, and we're going to try and get more money as often as we can? our attitude towards budget, schedule, complexity really shapes how we solve problems and how we make decisions. And so the winning characteristics not only have a skeleton crew and a shoestring budget and a cannonball schedule, but they like it, and they do that on purpose, and they look for opportunities to do more and more cool things with fewer and fewer resources, as opposed to on the right, those losing characteristics, those big, expensive, complicated systems tend to be led by people who say, hey, we have a problem. All right, let's just add more time and money to the package, spend a little more time, spend a little more money, and that will solve our problems. It almost never does.
So that's fantastic, and I want to apologize. I think we lost audio for a couple of minutes there, mostly because y'all missed a great joke. But we really only covered the characteristics of sort of the losing characteristics of the Death Star, the large budgets, the large teams, and long schedules, versus the characteristics of small projects like the Condor cluster, which operate with skeleton crews, shoestring budgets, and cannonball schedules. So the anecdote here is great. And I think a lot of people would agree here, but gosh, like if we only had some data, Dan, to back this up. Oh, wait a second. Wait, we do. We got data to back this up. This is from the Standish Group, and this is their chaos report. You know this subject matter really well. You know the folks over at the Standish Group. Tell us about how this data supports the case that we're building right now.
Yeah, great question. So the Standish Group is a program management research organization based out of Boston. I've been in touch with them for years, and their data not only sort of supports the conclusions that I came to, their data actually sort of drove the conclusions that I came to. I came to these conclusions based on looking in large part at their data. So what they've done is they've collected a big database of several hundred, in this case mostly IT for the data we're looking at here, mostly IT systems and IT development projects. And what they found is when they mapped out project size versus success rate, that the small projects with short schedules, tight budgets, and deep commitments to simplicity, those projects tended to succeed more often than the grand projects. And as the budget increases, as the schedule increases, as the program size increases, the likelihood of that individual project successfully delivering the capabilities envisioned goes down pretty precipitously, pretty quickly. And this is a consistent pattern. And what's interesting is you can map out project size versus success rate. You could also map out project budget versus success rate. You could map out complexity versus success rate. And in each case, guess what? The graph looks pretty much like it does on the screen right now.
And is it worth noting that I guess project size is sort of relative to what you're building? I mean, like a large project in weapon system design is going to be different than a large project in building software, right? So that's the relative project size, not a firm and fast rule.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I label them sort of small, medium, and large or grand, all these different categories, and not 1 to 10 people versus 10 to 20 people versus 100 people or more, because again, context matters tremendously. If you're just writing some code or coding an app, a small team might be one person or one person working part-time. If you're building a new fighter jet, for example, a small team might be 100 people. When that 100 people might be a huge team if you're writing some apps.
I mean, generally the same thing is true, right? And that's that autonomy, project autonomy, team autonomy is really a function of stakeholders and red tape. And so in this graph, we're kind of showing small, medium, and large and grand projects, and you can see on our x-axis we have like stakeholders and resources, and on our y-axis we have interference and red tape. Large and grand projects, the well-funded, long schedule, hundreds of people on the team, you get a lot of interference, right? You get the dollar threshold generally triggers a lot of internal reviews, your IRBs, your contract review boards. It raises interest from just about everybody. I mean, anyone in acquisition right now who's had a large budget or had a $10 million and above project knows that scope gets pretty popular. People want to tag on, right? So as the projects get larger and the interest gets bigger, your autonomy as a team and your ability to solve problems and get creative definitely goes down, right? Would you agree with that, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the ways I characterize it or describe it is that the program manager's influence is inversely proportional to the size of their budget. So the more money you're spending, the less influence you have over how that money gets spent. Because as your project gets larger, you present a larger target to the forces of change. You attract more attention from various levels. And it's kind of a common sense little analysis. You say if you're going to spend $1, your boss doesn't care about how you spend that dollar. If you're going to spend $10 million, not only does your boss care, but your boss's boss and your boss's boss's boss. So the more money you're spending, the more oversight, the more people want to get involved. Also, because oftentimes we equate size with prestige, so that these large and grand projects are the most prestigious, the high-profile projects. I think you find more and more people wanting to be attached to that program, and so then the growth sort of can spiral out of control if you're not careful, and then you end up with social loafing, where people are part of the team but don't really contribute to the team. You don't find a lot of social loafing on small projects. Everybody has to pull their own weight because there's just not as many people around to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the small project logic is something that we're seeing in trends towards agile development, towards small and modular development, taking really large and complex software challenges or any project challenge and breaking it down into manageable chunks so that you can focus on one problem at a time. And it's hard to solve one problem. It's especially difficult to solve 10 problems at once. So just keep that in mind, folks, especially in the sense of the prestige fallacy of the larger the budget, the larger the project, the more important the individual team members. So we want outcomes here, right? Not prestige. Outcomes deliver prestige. All right, so you wrote a book, FIRE. We wrote two, Simplicity Cycle as well, another great book. But FIRE, we're going to try to cover it, and we actually have a little bit more than 15 minutes, but I'm going to challenge you, Dan. Can we get 20 years of anecdotes in 20 minutes of time? I don't know if that's going to be possible or not. Well, but it is a great book, really approachable language. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I definitely tried to tell the stories in a way that were engaging and fun and entertaining. Hopefully people will laugh as much as they learn. And if you have to choose between one and the two, gosh, I kind of hope you laugh even more than you learn. But ideally, people will learn a little something useful and practical out of some of these stories. So I don't know if I can do it in 20 minutes. I think I can do it in 20 seconds. And so the core concept or the core takeaway, the basic finding in FIRE is that innovation does not have to cost so much, take so long, or be so complicated. That the cost overruns and the schedule delays that we often encounter, these are not inevitable attributes of an advanced technology system. In fact, our most innovative, most impactful, most important systems, again, like we saw previously, tend to be the result of small teams, short schedules, and tight budgets.
Yeah. Right. That's a pretty good elevator pitch for that. Yeah, I like that. So I think you sort of said what FIRE is in a nutshell. It's also kind of helpful to think about like what it's not, right? It's not about process improvement, okay? It's going to sound a little strange, but trust me for a second. It's about improving our objectives and outcomes rather than the process. You told me in kind of the prep for this that it was product centric, and I think I was maybe adopting the Jan Brady mentality of, but process, right? Process matters. But you told me, it was a little bit different than that. So describe a little bit more why FIRE is more about product focus and less about that process improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. So process matters. You want to have a good process, an elegant process. There's nothing wrong with having a good process. In fact, it's important to have one. Having said that, my big beef with this whole process improvement movement is that process-centric approaches tend to be process-centric, which sounds like that's a given. But a lot of people will sort of object and say, "Oh no, we're process-centric, but we're not process-centric." Well, oftentimes they tend to be. The goal is, or the danger with sort of that process-centric approach is that it tends to lose sight of both the people and the outcomes. So FIRE is all about enabling people to make good decisions that lead to good outcomes. Some of those good decisions might involve ways to improve the process, ways to streamline the process, ways to make the process more effective. But the emphasis is always on more effective, to produce better outcomes. That's what this is really all about. And so I deliberately wrote a book that would be hard to turn this book into a process sequence flow diagram or a process sequence model. There's not a checklist. There's not a series of steps, first this, then that, as a way to implement FIRE. And I think the next chart will talk a little bit more about what we do find in the book. Again, not a checklist, not a process approach, but an approach that we can apply to our processes, again, as we make decisions, as we solve problems, and as we get better outcomes.
Yeah, a process is kind of like a set of tools. I mean, it's an enabler. I remember when I bought my first condo, my dad bought me this awesome toolbox, and he gave it to me, but it did not make me a carpenter. In fact, I'm still a pretty lousy handyman. I had the tools, but I couldn't get an outcome out of that just because I had them. I think that's sort of a kind of a metaphor for that, and then a good lead into this slide, which is a case you make throughout FIRE, the book, that we should focus more on heuristics and less on rules if we want to master tradecraft in anything that we do. So we've got some tips for that, but if you could just give a quick definition of what you think heuristics are and why they're important, then we'll sort of jump into how folks can embrace them.
Yeah, absolutely. So a heuristic is just a rule of thumb. It's a general guideline, oftentimes handed down through oral tradition rather than in writing. And it's one of those sort of on-the-job training. Hey, generally when we're in this type of situation, we take this type of action, or we take this type of posture. Again, these are general rules that are helping to guide our decisions and our problem solving, but they're not hard and fast rules like if this, then that all the time. So I describe FIRE, it's more of a toolkit and not a rule kit. It's about finding the right tool for the right job as opposed to just compliance with checklists alone. Now, sometimes the right tool is a checklist. And so part of the idea then is to say, okay, in this case, this type of situation, we generally use this type of checklist. Here's how we go through it. And to acknowledge that, hey, there are instances when the checklist maybe plays a less prominent role in our decision making and in our problem solving.
And so heuristics basically help us master tradecraft because they teach us about the general protocols. It's not the specific if this, then that, or do explicitly this today, because that's never the case, especially in an environment as diverse as the government, as diverse as acquisition. You really got to understand what's sort of happening around you, and then use those heuristics as a guide for behavior and a guide for decision making when you're approached with uncertainty. I think that's one thing that anybody who's ever cooked at altitude knows, is that when you're cooking at altitude, things take longer to cook. You can't just follow that same recipe that you would cook at sea level, right? Because things are different. I think that's a nice metaphor for what can happen when you're just following strict process or strict FAR guidance, and you're trying to apply it in a situation with real humans and real people, right?
Yes, and that word uncertain is just so key. I think if we were living in a world where certainty was high, where there was not a lot of volatility, not a lot of change, not a lot of uncertainty, then by all means we can come up with a rule set that can guide our decision making because we know what sort of situations we're encountering. But in a world that has high levels of VUCA, I guess they call it, volatility, uncertainty, confusion, and ambiguity, when those are high, we can't come up with a comprehensive rule set. Instead, we must revert to tradecraft, heuristics, general guidelines.
Nice. I mean, I've always loved that concept of tradecraft and professionals just understanding how to wield everything in their toolbox, but even further than that, knowing when to use it in the right situation.
Yep.
So FIRE talks a lot about values. I mean, you don't mean like morals, right? Like this is a different type of value.
Correct. Yeah, I use the word values not as a theologian or not as a politician. I use the word value the way an engineer uses the word to refer to our preferences and our priorities, our measures of merit, our desirable attributes. So, for example, if we value the color blue, for example, then we would paint things blue. And if we value blue and we come across something that's green, we're going to like that green thing less because it's not blue. It has an attribute that doesn't align with something that we value. So our values will drive our design decisions in particular. You can't design anything without revealing what your values are. but they drive our problem-solving approaches and our actions. And both as a program manager and as a technology developer, in my academic research and in my practitioner work, I found that some values are more productive and more appropriate than others. And specifically, I found that when a team values speed, thrift, and simplicity, they tend to outperform teams that don't value these, or specifically teams that value the opposite of that. So oftentimes we come across, as you see on the screen there, teams that say, their general guideline, their heuristic, their rule of thumb is, hey, take your time and do it right. It's really important, so we got to make sure we are very rigorous and thorough and take as much time as you need. Or, hey, spare no expense. We get what we pay for, and we want to get a lot, so we better pay a lot. These are examples of other types of heuristics, other value sets where we value large budgets, we value long times, we value rigorous, thorough analysis. Teams that adopt that value set tend to not perform as well as teams that value speed, thrift, and simplicity. Which isn't to say speed, thrift, and simplicity is the opposite of rigor. It is a different type of rigor. It is a different type of learning. It is a different type of effectiveness. When you actually look at what comes out of these two different value sets, teams that value speed, thrift, and simplicity tend to produce technologies that are affordable, that are available when they're needed, and that are effective when they're used. So that affordable, available, effective sort of goal is more likely to happen if you're on the left side of the screen than if you're on the right side of the screen.
Right on. And I think that speed, thrift, and simplicity, you said it's not absent rigor. I mean, there is a different type of rigor. The rigor comes from restraint, I think, right? So restraint, which you say kind of compels creativity. It leads to better quality. It leads to, or forces, better decision making. If you have all the time in the world and all the resources in the world, there's not that much pressure to make decisions, and you don't have to solve as many problems, right? I mean, so talk about this a little bit, because I love this concept, and I think it's worth spending a minute.
Yeah. I think if you look at what's the common thread between speed, thrift, and simplicity, the one thing that they all have in common is they're all rooted in restraint or in constraints. That would be another way to describe it. So a restrained budget is a thrifty budget. A restrained schedule would be a fast schedule. A restrained amount of complexity would be a simple product process approach type thing. So restraint is kind of the common thread throughout the whole thing. And this sort of echoes back to that Condor cluster supercomputer story. The reason that team delivered a world-class advanced new technology for 1/10 of what it would have normally cost is because they did not have a big budget. They did not have a lot of time. They didn't have a big team. They couldn't just adopt the standard, typical approach. They were forced to get creative. So one of the heuristics I point to a lot is that constraints foster creativity. When there's not a lot of time and money around, we are forced to get creative. The good news is we can get creative even when we do have a lot of time and money. We're not forced to, but we still have the option. We still have the opportunity. So even if you got a big fat budget and all the time in the world, we can still choose to be more innovative and more creative. But these constraints sort of nudge us in that direction, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, you made a point earlier when we were talking in preparation for this, and I asked you the difference between constraints and restraints, and the answer was neat. You said constraints are really more externally imposed, whereas restraints are more an internal orientation. So your point that even teams with large budgets and a lot of time can still impose restraint on themselves to create and compel creativity.
Yes. So constraints tend to be imposed on you. Restraint is something that we express internally, sort of from our core. So any team, any individual can choose to express some restraint and not add time and money as a way to solve problems, for example.
And just as a note, R, of course, restraint. The R in fire is restrained, right? So that's I think why that's so crucial. Yeah, it's a great acronym. You know you're from the government when you can come up with a killer acronym like FIRE. So I think that's pretty cool.
Well, that's one of the things I learned in the military is if you come up with a good acronym and an iconic image, so something like FIRE, boy, you're 90% of the way there.
Half the battle. All right, so you've got a great story about when constraint and restraint wins, and that story is Stardust. You called it, and I laughed, a very simple spacecraft. I think that's great. So it had 3 directives, and I don't want to steal your thunder. Just give a little quick background on Stardust, and then we'll get to the 3 directives, or maybe that's actually part of the 3 directives. What was Stardust?
Yeah, sounds good. So I'm a huge space nerd, and I could literally talk about Stardust for the next 3 hours. So I'll try and give the brief overview of what this mission was about and what NASA accomplished. This is part of NASA's Faster, Better, Cheaper initiative in the late 90s. It actually launched in 1999 on a 5-year mission to encounter a comet named Wild 2. It's spelled wild, W-I-L-D, but it's pronounced Wild 2. And it had 3 objectives. 3 goals, 3 requirements, really, to use the formal term, was to encounter the comet, to collect some particles from the comet's tail, and then to return those particles to Earth. So really, a 3-line requirements document. Sounds like a pretty simple set of things they needed to accomplish. Now, obviously, these things are tremendously difficult. This mission had never been even attempted before, let alone actually accomplished. So a 5-year mission to encounter the comet. 3 billion miles total was how far it traveled. It was a 2-year return trip. So after 7 years in 1996, it actually returned a big collection of comet particles back to Earth successfully. I had a chance to speak with the program manager for this system several times in the course of writing the book, and he was very insistent in describing this as a very simple spacecraft. Now, those aren't words that go together very often, but he really insisted on it. He pointed out they were $1 million under budget, and one of the things they did with their design, actually let me back up a little bit, by having only 3 requirements, that greatly simplified and focused all of their other design decisions, all their problem-solving approaches, and said, look, this is what we need to do, not much else beyond this. So their design included a radio from the Mars Surveyor mission. That was from 1998, so just 1 year prior. But they also used a camera that was originally developed for the 1977 Voyager mission. So that's a pretty old camera.
Is that the oldest thing in space that's ever been man-made? Or, I mean, there are probably planets that are newer than that camera.
Yeah, probably. I mean, and Voyager was a very robust mission, and those spacecraft are still doing great work and great science. But, here it is, 1999. They're launching with basically a 22-year-old camera. Why would you use such an old camera on such an advanced spacecraft? Well, again, look at those 3 requirements. They had to encounter the comet, collect some particles, and bring those particles home. You don't need a fancy camera to do that. So they didn't need to design a new camera. They didn't need to pay for an expensive one. They basically got the cheapest camera they could find. But here's what's really cool about it.
And I'm just noticing the bullets here. Then you don't even need a spacecraft to encounter a comet. I mean, like my first bullet, like you could just come out with me and I'll wear a seersucker suit, and I'll encounter plenty of comets. Right. Clearly, that's a note there that I caught when I was going through. That's comet, folks, as in Halley's Comet.
That's
you
correct.
do not need to go to space to encounter comets.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I'm sure people can type in some comments on this as well. Yeah. So here's what's really cool about this. In 2005, NASA launched a mission called Deep Impact. It went to an asteroid named Temple 1, and its mission was to, as the name implies, launch an impactor to hit that asteroid, create a crater in the asteroid, and then take some pictures of the crater. And this was supposed to give us sort of a peek beneath the crust, give us a look at how that crater was built, like what the structure of the crater of the asteroid was. Turns out Temple 1 was dustier than anyone envisioned, so when the Deep Impact launched its impactor, it made a crater. It also made a great big dust cloud. So instead of getting photos of the crater, guess what? They got pictures of a cloud. So this is 6 years after Stardust had already launched. Now, having accomplished this entire mission, Stardust continued to sort of wander around the solar system. Somebody came up with the idea, what if Stardust could help rescue this Deep Impact, or salvage this Deep Impact mission? So in 2011, Stardust was now 12 years old. Its camera was now 34 years old. They managed to have it chase down Temple 1. It photographed that crater. The crater itself was now 6 years old, so all the dust had settled. And with a camera from 1977, in 2011, Stardust snapped pictures of that crater that were good enough. They got NASA the information they needed about the structure of that asteroid Tempel 1. And so, again, having achieved all their primary objectives, that Stardust was able to then salvage another mission that didn't even launch until 6 years after Stardust launched. So this is a very consistent pattern. When we look at technology development projects, simple systems tend to outperform their specs. They tend to do more than they were designed to do. So the idea that we get a 2-for-1 mission out of Stardust, it really shouldn't be a surprise. But it is a really cool story. And again, I could talk about that one all day. But the principles here of simplicity, of elegance, of a focused tool that ends up doing more than anybody designed it or imagined it could do, that pattern keeps popping up over and over again throughout all the data that we see, the data that we saw, for example, from the Standish group.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, the proof is really in the celestial pudding here. I mean, the tail of the tape, $1 million on a budget. Technology, like 12 and 34 years old, that's not that long in human terms. In technology terms, that's a significant amount of time. $1 million under budget, 34-year-old equipment. It spent time and space inactive and still salvaged the deep impact mission. I mean, talk about return on investment. That's just simply incredible. And actually, as our good friend Leo da Vinci says, simplicity really is the ultimate sophistication. So kudos to whoever built that thing. All right, Parkinson's law. This is sort of another way to put this stuff into context and to kind of do a little bit of myth busting, because as everybody knows, right, projects, typically in the government, projects don't always stick to their original scope and schedule. I think the number of projects that I worked on that were within scope and were within schedule are pretty much dwarfed by those that swallowed up additional time. The key here, and I'll let you jump in on Parkinson's law in a minute, is that does the additional time, does that always result in better outcomes, Dan, or more development?
Yeah, it turns out adding time doesn't necessarily correlate with adding value. So Parkinson's law gets stated in a couple of different ways, but the most common approach is, or description, is that work expands to fill the time allotted. My friends in the Army will often say if you wait till the last minute, it only takes a minute. I'm not sure I would go that far necessarily, but the idea, oh, there it is. But the idea that adding time
I'll go that far.
somehow increases the value, or adding time means you'll get more work done. That just doesn't hold up under the data. When you look at how programs actually run, how they actually function, if you've got 2 weeks to do it, you'll do it in 2 weeks. If you only have 1 week to do it, you'll do it in 1 week. And I think we can sort of find evidence of that in our own work lives. So suppose you have to, you absolutely have to get out of work, an hour earlier than usual one day. Turns out you can probably get most of the things you needed to get done that day an hour earlier. You can get it done in a compressed amount of time. So sort of Ward's corollary to Parkinson's law is that work is compressible. It's not infinitely compressible. At some point we reach a point where there's just not enough time to do the work, but we can get a lot closer to that floor than we typically do. And so one of the things I often recommend practitioners and program managers consider or take a look at is, what are some ways we can sort of deliver something sooner? We can reduce our schedule to delivery. We can get something out into the world faster. We can shorten the schedule. And we find that the things that we needed to get done, we often can get done faster if we sort of get creative about some of these schedule constraints.
Yeah, and if you're not buying this, do this at home. Try this. There's a technique called the Pomodoro method, and it's not about tomatoes. It is about setting a timer, setting a fixed amount of time, generally 25 to 45 minutes, where you'll eliminate all distractions and focus 100% on a task or a project that you're working on. And if you do this, I think you'll notice that in that 25 to 45 minutes, you'll get more done on that task than you can get done in 2 hours with the distractions of the normal day or where you're not 100% focused. And so the point being, if you restrain yourself to a specific amount of time, you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish. That's the Pomodoro technique, bringing tomatoes into the workplace. No, just kidding. But it is cool.
Great summary, and Dan Pink has a great, I think, 2-minute video he calls it his pink cast, on that specific Pomodoro technique. If anybody wants a little more information on it, you can Google Dan Pink and the Pomodoro technique.
Yeah, Dan Pink's great. He's got some of my favorite books out there. Another heuristic that you talk about in FIRE is starting before we start. And I can speak a little bit to this one, given my experiences as a contracting officer with the government. But you know, there's a lot of lead time right before we actually get to the official work. You could consider the official work being the day that the contract's signed, or the day that the 2237 or the PR gets issued to you, or whenever. The point being, there is usually a lot of time before that time that you get started. And so starting before we start is incredibly important for bureaucracy hacking. There are things that we can do to get prepared before the official work, because inevitably, when that official work hits, you're going to have so much to do then, and you're going to have so much to catch up on. Your head's going to spin. So some of the things that we can do to get prepared and to get ahead, especially in contracting, are to start building relationships with our customers, with our suppliers, right? Start talking to folks, talk to users, especially. This is especially critical with any type of citizen-facing service or product. You don't have to have an official mandate to start talking to people and asking them how they would use something or what their problems are. You don't need an official launch date to start doing strategic market research. I mean, that's something that we as procurement professionals and acquisition professionals should be doing all the time, learning about our sectors, learning about our categories. I think sharing draft requirements is another great way to get prepared. I would do this quite a bit. And I don't mean you have to do draft RFPs or draft SUs, although I wouldn't discourage it. You can share it with people in your own office and say, hey, take a look at this. Does this make sense to you? You're a human. Can you read this? And then electronic contract management systems, the ECMS tools out there. We know that it's easy to what's the word I'm looking for? Procrastinate, yes, and save the entry in that data until later. But that is just going to be a headache, because once the project kicks off, if you haven't prepared your ECMS file, your contract management system file, you're going to be underwater as it is. So do all of this getting prepared work, getting ahead work before the official work starts, and then you can really focus on the outcomes. Anything to add on that one, Dan?
Yeah, so the way I sort of characterize the heuristic that we can use to capture this idea is that the key to finishing early is to start early. And it turns out when we have a firm deadline, the only way to add time to our project, or the best way to add time to our project, is on the front end. And you don't have to be a time lord or a time traveler to do that. A lot of the things you just mentioned there, the key is to just proactively maintain and continually refresh a stable of prototypes and other materials and relationships that you can build on. And that's a way that we can kind of begin the work before it officially begins. So again, the heuristic there, if you want to kind of jot that down, is the key to finishing early is to start early.
And yep, and there are plenty of things you can do to start before you start. Anti-fragility is another concept of FIRE that I think is worth talking about. And we'll revisit the Death Star through the lens of anti-fragility, so you can kind of help us understand that. So tell us how the Death Star is the opposite of anti-fragile, or fragile for those of you who prefer.
Right,
Yep.
The opposite of anti-fragile would be indeed fragile. So the term anti-fragility comes from a book by Nassim Taleb titled Anti-Fragile. So let's just unpack that word a little bit. When we say something is fragile, that means it breaks when it is subjected to stress. So anti-fragile are things that get stronger when they are subjected to stress. They are anti-fragile. They're the opposite of fragile. So it turns out big, monolithic, complex projects like Death Stars tend to be fragile. And the impact of their fragility tends to be large. So we've put all our eggs in one basket. We lose from failure. If that thing goes down, if it gets blown up, then that's a huge loss, a huge expense. In contrast, if we have a portfolio of iterative, incremental, small projects like NASA's Faster, Better, Cheaper portfolio, where they launched, depending on whose number you believe, either 16 or 25 missions under this Faster, Better, Cheaper umbrella, when we have that portfolio, any individual project might fail, but we learn from that failure. So it makes our organization anti-fragile. So even when things go badly, we get better. With the Death Star, if things go badly, we just get dead. So what you
your
want
point
to
is really, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, we can't avoid failure entirely. What we want to find, since some failure is inevitable, there will be some failures, we want to make sure we have data-rich failures, failures that teach us something, as opposed to failures that are not data-rich, data-poor failures. Like if you spend 20 years and at the end of that 20 years you figure out you were on the wrong path, that is not a lot of useful data for you. If you spend a week and you discover you're on the wrong path, that is a data-rich failure. We can apply that lesson to our next project.
So in terms of the Death Star, you're saying the Emperor might have been better off just trying to build like a hurtful star, something a little less
right? Yeah,
there, something like
a mildly irritated star, right?
I mean, it is. I mean, right? It's so complicated. You're never going to find all the bugs in a huge system, right? It's impossible. It's just too many ins and outs, right?
As complexity goes up, it's virtually impossible to discover all the bugs, all the flaws, all the uncovered thermal exhaust ports, like on the Death Star. It's just harder to find the flaws. Whereas a small, inexpensive, simple system that only does one or two things really well, any flaws, any bugs tend to be much more visible.
I mean, in terms of government project metaphors, Dan, you really are the king. And we'll talk about one more. And this sort of, in my opinion, kind of wraps it up. And it's a note for program owners, and it's something that you've adapted from, here you go, nerd reference number 2, from Star Wars, the Fire Prime Directive. So I'll read it, and then I'll just ask you to tell us about really where you got the inspiration for us. And that your Prime Directive for program owners, the Fire Prime Directive, is that project leaders may not interfere with the natural progression of a project by introducing unnecessarily advanced technologies or excessive over-engineered features. I can only imagine there's heads nodding everywhere right now. I mean, if anybody would not like their project leader or supervisor to abide by this Prime Directive, please call me right now. I'd like to understand. But no, tell me about the inspiration for this and go a little bit deeper into the Prime Directive, because I love it.
So I mentioned before, of all the articles and papers and things that I've written, my most well-known paper is the one where I referenced Star Wars. I've always felt a little bit bad about that because I'm really more of a Trekkie than a Star Wars guy. I've given the choice, I would much rather watch Star Trek than Star Wars. So when it came time to write this book, I said I've definitely got to work in some lessons from Star Trek in here as well. And so naturally I gravitated towards what in Star Trek is called the Prime Directive. And in Star Trek, in that Star Trek universe, the Prime Directive says, we should not interfere with the natural progression of a culture. In specific terms, it often means, don't introduce warp drive technology to a culture before they are ready to naturally discover warp drive technology on their own. It's a great idea. It's an important principle, and they explore some really interesting ideas through the films and the shows by working with this Prime Directive and figuring out when can we break it. When is it okay to sort of violate the Prime Directive? Similarly, with the Fire Prime Directive, I just sort of tweaked it a little bit that said project leaders should not introduce unnecessarily advanced technologies or over-engineered features into our systems. So, for example, when Stardust decided to use a 1977 camera in a 1999 spacecraft, that was consistent with the Prime Directive. Had they gone with a fancier camera, a more expensive camera, a more advanced camera, that would have been a violation of this Prime Directive by basically over-engineering the thing and giving it more capabilities than it really needed. And there's a lot of different ways to sort of implement and interpret this. But like the Star Trek version, the Fire Prime Directive is one that we will occasionally violate, and it's okay to do that as long as we reflect on it afterwards. We talk about it. We admit it. We have a conversation and we say, okay, in this case, I didn't follow the Prime Directive because X, Y, Z. And the effect was, was whatever. And here's what I learned from it. And I should have done it, or it's okay that I didn't. And you see that with Captain Kirk and Janeway in particular, my favorite captain. Janeway was pretty fantastic about being reflective and deliberate about it, both beforehand and afterwards.
I made a few ambitious claims in some emails to people trying to drum up additional support for this, that we would actually hit the trifecta of Star Wars, Star Trek, and a Battlestar Galactica metaphor in this in this webinar. Can you get that for us? Can you achieve a Battlestar Galactica? Is there any reference at all that we can use? I'll give you a minute to think about it.
So I did mention Doctor Who briefly when I talked about Time Lords. I must admit, and I'm going to have to probably turn in my nerd card, I haven't watched much Battlestar Galactica, at least not the new ones. I'm just behind on my viewing, so I'm sorry. I've disappointed you all for the last time.
Well, I guess when you're writing books, you have to give something up. All right, so we did want to leave y'all with some practical takeaways here, because I think that's something that we're trying to promote with what we're doing at Public Spend Forum and our community learning channel. So here's a way to adapt a FIRE principle right in your workplace, and it's this great exercise that you talk about in the book called trimming. And it's something that you can use to simplify your next presentation, your next requirements document, or system architecture design, or any really other technical document that you're working on. Tell us for a minute, Dan, about trimming and how you kind of do that.
Yeah, so the trimming practice comes from a design discipline called TRIZ. That's an acronym spelled T-R-I-Z. It's a Russian acronym, means the theory of inventive problem solving. And basically this particular practice is something that TRIZ practitioners will use to simplify and streamline their system architectures, their requirements documents, their presentations. And it basically, in a nutshell, it involves removing a part, removing a piece, a component from whatever thing you're working on, and then seeing if you can achieve all your objectives in the absence of that part. And you'd be surprised how often you can remove something that even seemed essential and still make the system do what you needed it to do. And just recently I've taken to recommending that people don't call these things pieces, parts, functions, call them complications. How many complications will you allow to be in your design? How many complications will you allow to be on your PowerPoint presentation, for example? You may need some, but just be careful how many of them we allow to remain.
Very cool. I suggested to my wife that we trim diapers out of the kids and just go straight to cloth. That was not embraced by my Lord Commander. So if anybody wants to try this and get credit for it, this demonstrated learning, another thing that we're experimenting with is learning badges. So learning badges are visual representations of skills earned. You can take them with you. They're highly portable. They're embedded with metadata, and they're kind of a trendy new thing in adult learning. So if anybody wants to give it a try and earn an innovation badge in trimming that we can issue to you, take this opportunity. And in the email that we send out sort of following up on this webinar, we'll have some more specific instruction about how you can conduct a trimming exercise and submit demonstrated learning to earn this badge, and then show it off to all of your friends, like we know that you will. So that's coming out soon, so look out for that. And obviously, like we said, that you can earn a continuous learning credit for your time today. We know that's important for professionals out there and their continuous learning. So if you want to qualify for that, again, we're going to send out a real quick email after the webinar is done. And it'll have a comprehension survey that you'll just need to fill out. You complete that, and we will mail you your CLP certificate. But in true infomercial fashion, there is more. We have a learning path that you can get a little bit deeper with some of Dan's teachings, and we would love to host a simplicity workshop where we can kind of get a little bit deeper into some of these tools. So if anybody's interested, you can just reach out to us. And you can take the learning path and engage with us that way. And again, in our follow-up email, we'll have more information on all that. So the learning doesn't stop here. Unfortunately, our humorous banter and really lame jokes do. But I appreciate your time, Dan, and everybody for being on the line. Any closing thoughts for us before we depart? And actually, I'd like to open it up for questions, seeing that we do have a couple minutes. But any last things on your mind?
Yeah, sure. One thing I always like to mention to audiences and different groups is that I don't know what decisions you get to make. I don't know what problems you get to solve, But I suspect that for most of us in the program management profession, a lot of the decisions we make and the problems we solve involve making a decision between an option that's a little more expensive and a little bit less expensive, one that will take a little longer or one that will be a little shorter, one that's a little more complicated or one that's a little bit simpler. And I would suggest that, again, based on my experience and my research and for other reasons that I write about in the book, that we get better results, better outcomes, more important, more impactful, more innovative results when we move in that direction of speed, thrift, and simplicity. So this isn't going to fix the world. We're not going to solve world hunger or boil the ocean. But for the decisions you do get to make, for the problems you do get to solve, I hope you'll have a go at moving in the direction of speed, thrift, and simplicity in each case and see how it goes. I'll be interested to hear from anybody if they do give that a try. And, of course, you can reach out to me on my website at thedanward.com. That's THE, and then my name, danward.com.
That's fantastic. Dan, thanks a lot. We have a couple questions coming in. Somebody asked if we were going to send out the slide deck, and we absolutely will, in that email along with some additional instruction on how you can continue your learning beyond just this webinar. So I don't see too many other questions coming in. I do see some kudos. Great webinar. Thanks, Carlos, out there. We appreciate that. We hope you've enjoyed it. I know I did. And hoping we'll be able to do some more of these in the future. So stay tuned, everybody. And Dan, thanks for your time.
All right. Hey, thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of these stories and some of these ideas. And best wishes to everybody out there and whatever you get to do.
Great. All right. We'll give you 3 minutes back. Go trim something. Bye, folks.
I love it. All right. Take it easy.